Is a U.S. Civil War likely? That doesn't sound as boring as our normal topic, but this is Boring AF Politics. Nonetheless, I'm Dr. Dave Hayes. And Rich, introduce yourself.
Rich Ledet, Associate Professor at Troy University. I'm one of Dave's colleagues and ready to chat.
All right. And as always, Troy University has absolutely nothing to do with this. They have not reviewed, not approved, disclaim, disclaim, disclaim.
These
Okay,
are
moving on.
my opinions. Your opinions are yours.
Why are we even talking about this? All right. There was a opinion piece in CNN was published on March 16th and by Bruce Hoffman and Jacob Ware. And now Bruce Hoffman is a renowned scholar on terrorism, literally wrote the book, right? Inside Terrorism, now in its third edition. Jacob Ware is a younger scholar who is working and doing research on domestic terrorism. They wrote an op ed piece talking about whether or not a civil war was likely. And honestly, without casting any hate on legitimate scholars, colleagues, that sort of thing, it seems to me like this is what happens when you try to not be boring, right? You write a article about a civil war and they go through and they kind of rehearse the argument for why there is. They cite the people who are saying, oh, one Canadian author, it's not a question of if the United States is going to self-destroy itself or is going to come to an end, but how and when. And they go through all the arguments, and then halfway through, they go, well, we don't think that's as likely because of the lack of geography involved in this. And so they kind of push back on it and then go, but what we do think is more likely is a IRA style terrorism, right? That we can see terrorism breaking out in the United States. And honestly, I'm a little bit, I look at this and I go, guys, I could do so much with this. One, I have two objections. I'll broadly sketch them. Let Rich go in with what he thinks. I think one, they don't have the data at a research methods level. I feel that they are not bringing the data, and they are not posing the question in a way. They're saying, "Hey, look, this is what's we see domestic terrorist groups in the United States. We see Ireland, so yeah, that's what's going to happen." They're seeing correlations. They're not looking cross sectionally in a way. I always say if you're going to say whether something is going to occur, you have to say whether it's going to occur or not. And you have to consider the not cases. And I don't feel that they're doing that. The other thing is, on the face of the logic, I don't feel it's a very comparable situation. The IRA and the current and any presumed, you know, Biden wins the election and Trump supporters run amok. I don't see the parallels at a face logic level. But Rich, what do you think on this?
Well, I I did not like the op-ed because I think it's junk scholarship. I'll just straight up say that. I think they
Tell
could
us
have
how you
been
feel.
well, I think they could have been a lot smarter about it, and I think like you suggested, they could have brought a little more data, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
some public opinion data, I guess, perhaps, because this I appreciate it for being like an overview of the topic, but this is an op-ed in on CNN's website, and I don't. I would use this in class to promote discussion about the topic, but I wouldn't be referencing this in my dissertation where I'm trying to say yes or no, right? I guess because I think about and I'm glad they talked about geography, okay? Because if there's a civil war, I live in Alabama. We're the reddest of the red, and we have a lot of gun owners because one issue that they bring up is gun ownership. And I will say it's not just the right that owns guns, the left owns guns too. Maybe the proportions are off, but if Alabama were to all of a sudden secede from the Union, what's going to happen to all of those Apache helicopters at Fort Novosel? What's going to happen to the Lockheed Martin production facility up the road in
Mm.
Pike County? What's going to happen to Maxwell Air Force Base? Is that all of a sudden going to become Alabama's? Are all of those officers and enlisted personnel who operate that machinery instantly going to say, we voted for Trump, let's go to war with our fellow citizens? So the geography question is interesting to me because in our own Civil War, there were some clear cut lines, right? At least geographic lines. It doesn't mean that there were no slavery supporters in the North and there were no abolitionists in the South, because there were, right? But there were some clear cut geographic lines, and it was a whole lot easier to say, you know what, forget you guys up there, we're going to do our own thing. And then we all know what happened. So I just think that we've also done a good job and done a good job in our political system of trying to, I guess, turn our political grievances into a process, right? We're supposed to use elections. We're supposed to use other forms of political engagement, not political violence. And we've done a fairly good job in the broad scope of human history of, I guess, institutionalizing our political grievances. Now, I don't know if that's going to hold in the future, right? But we let politics, not violence, and not terrorism, kind of dictate what the outcomes are going to be. Now, that also implies that citizens are able to accept the process and be part of the process, but also accept the outcomes of an election, for example, right? So now I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit and I'm going to say we're already in a civil war. We're already doing that to ourselves. It's just not a, daily violent bloodshed out on the battlefields. Because I'm wondering, what if you have a civil war and no one shows up? Every time I hear politicians, political pundits, or candidates mostly saying something's going to happen, I'm saying you want something to happen. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess. And the other thing that is, like, they introduce a term that was brought to my attention several years back, the idea of accelerationists, people who do these events and who engage in violence because they want to accelerate the demise of Western civilization, or they want to bring forth the rise of Christian nationalism, or they want to start the new racial civil war by walking into a church service in South Carolina and shooting a bunch of parishioners with the hopes that other white people are going to engage in the same activity and start a civil war. Because if I'm not mistaken, that actually happened, right? So I think we're already kind of doing that, and there are radical elements among us that are willing to resort to political violence to get the outcomes that they desire, rather than let the democratic political system, which is flawed, greatly flawed, right? But that only underscores the point that we need more citizens who are active and engaged and tolerant and knowledgeable of what the system is, so that maybe we can have less killing, right? There are already people who are engaging in mass shootings for these reasons. But I'm still wondering, where's the battle lines, because I want to make sure I'm on the right side, because I have guns too, So
Don't
and,
say
and
that.
and
We don't want to say that.
well, but if people are shooting at me, so see the whole idea though of a civil war, and you do what you will with this, but you see this whole idea confuses me.
Yeah. And a couple of things you said that I want to pick up on the accelerationist thing.
Mhm.
This is where a greater focus on the causal mechanism, right? I mean, you just take a look and say, well, this sort of looks like that, right? But and that's what I think they're doing. I'm like, well, wait a minute, wait a minute.
Hmm.
When terrorist groups have, when people have used political violence as a means of this acceleration, it's typically been that they use violence on behalf of their group, right? And they use violence against the state or the occupying power or whatever. They use it against the oppressive, what they view as the oppressor,
Hmm.
and then they trigger a backlash. And it's usually, the one thing that seems pretty consistent in the stories of successful terrorist movements is that they attack something, some entity, usually a state, creating a backlash
Yeah.
that then becomes the issue for their people. And they do what, I hate to say it, but look at what Hamas did. They had an
Hmm.
outrageous attack that brought down an outrage. I'm sorry, there's violence going on, right? And the thing is, the backlash is the point. If you can get
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
state to attack your group, then the group hates the state.
Yeah.
And going into a church, the kinds of acts you've mentioned that have occurred, they don't work as acceleration
Hmm.
because they're not against the state, they're against a group, right? And that group, like, maybe if you got that group to rise up and radically, indiscriminately attack your side, that would work. But honestly, we're a long way from that. You go and shoot up a black church, they are not storming the country club.
Yeah.
That's not the response you're going to get.
Hmm.
If you go in and in a lot of countries, if you represent an ethnic group and you attack uh, the state, the state then controls the ethnic group and does all sorts of things to hunt you down. And that's honestly what happened in Ireland,
Yeah.
right? Is the Irish could, uh, well, one, they reacted to certain things that were going on, but then they could get into that thing of like, hey, if you're on the sidelines, we're going to poke the British, we're going to shoot a
Hmm.
few soldiers,
Yeah.
right? And then they're going to be more heavy handed and they're going to piss you off.
Yeah,
To
and that's a really good explanation because that's part of like why I'm confused because I don't think the literature supports. I don't think what we know about this already. Now, I'm not saying something crazy can't happen in the future, and all of the preppers come out of the woodwork and figure out what the battle lines are, you know, and we engage in this messy urban combat or rural combat. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know what they think it's going to look like, you
Well,
know.
I don't know. I don't know that they
I
don't
mean,
have a story, right?
I'm using the word they, but these accelerationists or these,
And in this case, these authors and the
scholars.
authors they quote, the
Yeah.
people who want to predict that this is going in that direction. I think they also, stepping away from that aspect of it, um, I don't know that, we see, like, Charlie Kirk recently said, if Biden is elected, the next day you've got to be ready to fight.
Yeah.
And
I've heard that
one,
before, though.
what?
I've heard those kind of things before.
We've heard that before, and I would go back to Theda Skocpol and her work with the Tea Party, because she has addressed a similar thing. She talked about the stop the steal, right? And she says, look, it's a metaphor, right? And you've probably heard the expression that you shouldn't take that Trump's followers don't take him literally, but they take him seriously.
Mm.
And her argument would be it's a metaphor. And so I look at it and go, look, um, yes, there is a lot of language that is being used. We have to be ready for a fight. We have to be ready for a war. This is metaphor. The ownership of firearms is often metaphor,
Hmm.
right? And y- the the people that walk around with them, they walk around with them because they make them feel good, right? They make
Yeah.
them feel, it's basically cosplay,
Yeah.
right?
And
Um,
your comments though
Yeah.
about this being, about the political rhetoric aspect.
Hmm.
This is rhetoric designed to make you pick sides, right? And that's why I think it's dangerous to just ignore it, because you had to pick sides during the Civil War, or like go out to California or something.
Right.
You had to pick sides, go north or go south, but regardless, everybody's fighting. you know so that's why I have, my brain, I can't wrap my brain around this, or even why would anyone resort to this kind of language. you know to me, that's coming from a point of desperation. And I've heard this kind of accelerationist language since I was a child, because of the upbringing that I had and the people who raised me. And I've heard this over and over again. Now, is it being ramped up? Yes. Are we in a fight for survival? Yes. I guess. Everything doesn't have to be an existential crisis, though. But the more you make everything about politics is an existential crisis, you increase the probability that bad actors in society are going to do evil things. And I think the prevalence of guns in society is only like, hey, this is a possibility with something that already happened. But I think you're making connections that aren't necessarily there.
And,
So
and I would say that to
not
pick up
you,
on that,
but the authors are making connections that they're seeing something that's not there, but in part because they are terrorism scholars.
they have a hammer. Yeah,
Mhm.
and hedgehog, fox, that whole thing. I would say though, you're very right. I think that the language, um, I don't know if the language is accelerist, right? Acceleration is about how the
Yeah.
terrorism, how the acts produce that. The language is about securitization,
Mhm.
right? And that phenomena of, and also the what Christina Kimball has called the securitization of subjectivity, where you securitize identities. And so rhinos are evil. We create an identity of rhino, and then you say rhinos are threatening, and then you have an ad with a politician racking a pew pew. I'll call it that so that TikTok doesn't ban it. But he racks a shotgun and says, "Let's go hunting for rhinos. It's open
Yeah.
season on rhinos." This is language that's starkly, it seems violent. I
Mhm.
think it's metaphorical, but it is aimed at creating that enemy image,
Yeah.
creating that us versus them. And yes, you have to pick a side. Everything you said, absolutely. And I think the thing is that yes, it can lead to people taking violent action, but at that point, that screws everything up,
Yeah.
right? Like if you go out and say that there's a pizza parlor in a major city in the United States that is trafficking children. They have children that are being used as sex slaves in the basement, and then they are killed and eaten. If you go out and say that, and then someone believes you, what is the only logical thing? If I believe that there is a pizza parlor where children are being abused, what is the only moral, sensible thing for me to do? It's to cowboy up, take my my gravy seal butt up there and storm in and rescue the children. And as soon as you actually do that, all the people that were spewing that rhetoric, not because it's true, but because it's metaphor, right? Because it is polarizing, right? They suddenly have a real problem because they have to admit, well, no, it wasn't you. You should never have done this because we were exaggerating. We were not telling you the truth. And so I think January 6th was the logical outcome of the speeches and the violent rhetoric, and the storming of the Capitol was the logical outcome of that.
Mhm.
But as soon as it happened, it was so wildly counterproductive,
Yeah.
right? As soon as that violence occurred, it was not accelerationist. It was decel. It was go the other direction. You had people
Yeah.
abandon Trump temporarily, temporarily, but you went the other direction.
Mhm.
And so this is my thing is that, look, what's happening in the rhetoric is one thing. It's achieving a goal like you described. It runs the risk of inadvertently sparking violence, but that violence is counterproductive to the purpose of the rhetoric in the first place,
Yeah. Yeah.
and therefore it collapses. Timothy McVeigh, remember
Hmm.
him?
Yeah.
Um, were
He
you
killed.
alive then?
Yeah, I was. He killed a lot of innocent people. You know,
I
I was alive.
all
In
right.
fact,
I don't know. You're young.
I used to work on those Bradleys. That I think he was a
Yeah.
Bradley gunner, I believe.
Well, Timothy McVeigh in what was it, 90, 80?
Oklahoma City.
Yeah, it was 91, 92. Um, uh, uh, yeah, I'm gonna actually it was probably 93 or 4. He set up the truck bomb, and there was a militia movement that had
Hmm.
been established that was making all this one. There's a one world government. The UN is going to occupy us, and they started having all of this conspiracy theory stuff. And his plan was absolutely accelerationist.
Yeah.
Let's go out, let's blow something up, and this is very actually very often the story that terrorists tell themselves, that one their act will bring forth this outpouring. And he had the exact opposite of it. Everyone was so shocked at what he did
Yeah.
that the militia movement at that time basically fell apart. No one wanted to be part of it. And so it's again the opposite. And so I just look at it, I go, look, that seems to me more likely what happens. uh I got a guy down the street back during COVID when I would take my dogs for like 2 hour long walks, because what else am I going to do? There's a guy who's a 3 percenter, and he's building a compound, right? He's like building walls around his house. He has all his flags, and come and take them. And I would walk by his. He was building. He was a very bad mason. He was building walls, and he had cameras. And I'm just looking at what he's doing and going, dude, if I wanted to take this position, thank you. You just gave me so many great positions. I just was like, it
Yeah.
was so stupid, right?
So
And the point though is he's doing that. Where was he when the election went the other way? It's metaphor. Those parapets, those all that stuff he's doing. He is LARPing, man. You know, and
so
yeah,
what's the difference between and Timothy McVeigh? I want to say that was 95. What's the difference between what Timothy McVeigh did and the first World Trade Center bombing in I think the early 90s, maybe a little bit before that? Because that was Timothy McVeigh. That was a domestic terrorism.
right,
But the first World Trade Center bombing, I believe, was a precursor to what Al Qaeda eventually accomplished.
right. They Al Qaeda was, uh, their plan,
Mhm.
the evolution of their thinking, right? If you read like under the banner of heaven, and all the scholarship on this, which I don't have the sites ready because this was a double clutching gear shift. But their plan was to attack the United States and fight that far enemy.
Mhm.
And so it was very obvious that part of it was their goal was to overthrow what they considered the apostate rulers, the US backed people in the region. And
Mhm.
so they had some notion that if they conducted the far jihad, they could isolate these
Yeah.
guys from them. um that was less successful than perhaps when we invaded Iraq, right? And you had the Al Qaeda in Iraq, Al Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, and there it was very explicit that the uh, that they had gotten the backlash that they could use. I don't know that they originally intended the backlash to be the point, but certainly when the backlash involved the United States invading Iraq, which it kind of did,
Yeah.
right? Then it was, hey, look, we have crusaders. They're here, and we can go in and we can organize people, fight the U.S. while simultaneously proselytizing them and explaining to them the system. And that was very explicitly al-Zawahiri's plan, as he wrote to the leader in a letter we captured. Right, if you read that letter, and you parse out all the flowery language, you get to this plan. And so that was, that's about sparking the reaction against us, right? That's the acceleration that works. Is I get this other guy to do something so horrible to my people that they side with me, right? And that they are more likely to be part of my coalition. And that's forever been, in resistance things. If you punk the occupier, um, or the state into doing bad things to your folks,
Mhm.
uh, then it's on, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, and I mean, look at that's that's why what Hamas did was brutal to begin with, but that's why they took it up a few notches.
I
And I
I hate
think,
to even go there with that, because people just have no,
yeah, you're
that
right.
is so not boring.
That's
But
sensitive.
my reaction when I watched them is I said, "Oh my God, you guys have conducted this in a manner that you are calling the thunder down."
Hmm.
And I was like, you know,
Yeah,
and my reaction was, "You all know how this works. You have engaged in this conflict since your grandfather was, around running it." And my reaction was, they must want it. They must have some story they're telling themselves that this backlash is going to be good for them. That's the only way I could, see a group. I mean, it's one thing to be mad and go do something because you hate people. When you put that much effort into planning an operation, rehearsing, training it,
yeah.
you have told a story. Strategy is often called a story in the future tense.
Mhm.
You've told a story in the future tense about why this is going to have a good outcome for you, or put you in a better position to do something. Probably, and I wonder what that is,
Yeah.
because it's hard. I mean,
And this
yeah,
this is tough stuff to talk about,
yeah,
like as a scholar and with other scholars as we're trying to figure this out. I can only imagine what's going on in the general population trying to make sense of this. But I will say, kind of like, let's go back to US's invasion of Iraq. I'm not sure if that was how the Islamic State was born, but it sure amplified that movement.
oh yeah,
And just recently, we've got the Islamic State taking credit for a terrorist attack in Russia that killed over 100 people so far. And I mean, the news is still, I'm dating us a little bit here. I'm dating us a lot. But look, the news is still coming in, and I've
right,
got 133 people killed, 4 gunmen arrested. And the Islamic State is saying, we did that, you know?
right. And the Islamic State, and we don't have the news on this, right? And we don't have. There are reports of payments being made to people to carry this out. The Islamic State is really good about radicalizing individuals,
Yeah.
and their goal is to radicalize them to conduct the violence, which then gives them a cachet on the international stage and brings them. And the thing is that they're a different model, in the sense
Yeah.
that I don't know that they're trying to create the backlash. They're not, they're not benefiting from the backlash. They're not forming an identity, mobilizing people in their ethnic group. They're more of a niche extremist group that, goes out there. And you can radicalize people politically, like QAnon,
Yeah.
right? And not to offend anyone, I think we could just all safely say this is not cool, right? What they do, and yet they are not radicalizing to get someone to commit violence. They are radicalizing in support of other political of another
Yeah.
process. And so, um, again, could that lead to somebody doing something violent? Yes, absolutely. It'd be weird
Well,
if it didn't.
well, Dave, that's my original concern about all
Yeah,
this talk and using that political rhetoric. I mean, much like the Islamic State is very successful at radicalizing individuals,
right.
I think this, overblown rhetoric about civil war. Because again, I'm just wondering who knows how to fly those Apache helicopters over there on Fort Novosel.
Yeah,
You
it,
know,
it's not gonna happen like the old Civil War because
no,
you
no,
know the military in that time, and there was a very small regular army, but the overwhelming military strength of the United States was in the militias, the National Guard uh, equivalent, even our National Guard today, right? There are National Guards in those states. They are federalized. You would have to really have a lot of people change their mind. And they are also, it only functions as part of a larger force.
mm,
And so the type of military we have today, the type of economy we have today, it doesn't work. It wouldn't work like it worked in the Civil War. And like you say, those soldiers, they're not, you try to tell them to go fight against the United States. Uh, I think they're going to have a real hard time with that.
yeah, I
Um,
still don't like. Where are people going to show up and do this?
yeah,
Right. That's why I
they
say
aren't, because
people
that's
are.
not the point of it,
Yeah,
right?
it's
The
already
point of the
it's.
rhetoric is to move you in
Yeah.
and to have political things happen.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, and that's where I say, like I say, if the rhetoric's very dangerous because it can lead to people going off script, but they're going off script, right? They're
Yeah.
the guys that are going off script, and they are not going to be, you're not going to be happy with those people,
Hmm.
right? They say about terrorist organizations, they don't like crazy people, right? They have a certain person they want to have in there, and the really truly vicious, uncontrollably, insane killers, they don't want them because they can't. They won't follow orders, and they weed those people out sometimes
Yeah.
violently,
Yeah.
and um, that's what I'm saying is that those groups that actually pursue violence and civil wars, they're trying to pursue that, and so they create a system that moves you in that direction. These other systems, even though they're using metaphors that are very violent, they're trying to get you to go out and vote, to send, basically to
Yeah.
send your money in, is
Yeah.
what they're trying to do.
And this rhetoric, though, going back to something we said earlier, like
Yeah,
this forces you to pick sides in one of the most drastic ways. Because a civil war, you're essentially calling your fellow citizens the enemy, and not
right,
like it's all couched in this political rhetoric, you know. But this has a great potential not just to radicalize individuals who go off script and engage in actual acts of political violence, but to what extent is this eroding trust in our public and political institutions? I think it's very successful at doing that, right? And we need to be critical of our public institutions, but we shouldn't be to the point where we don't trust the very system that, like, frankly, especially some of these political pundits calling for civil war, make a lot of money doing so, you know?
right.
So it's taking advantage of the political system for your own, like, economic gains is one thing, but you guys are anybody calling for this and saying this is going to happen, I think, is only contributing to the erosion of political institutions. I wish these scholars would have taken that approach in the op-ed that we're talking about, instead of like pushing the conversation further in a direction that I don't think is appropriate based upon the data, based upon
Yeah,
what the empirical evidence indicates to us. That you've I think very I think you've done a very good job of discussing how these different terrorist organizations operate and what their what their goals are, but also what the means of achieving those goals might be.
yeah. Honestly, I spent more time studying terrorist organizations and U.S. elections. So, it's been a big part of my career, I have to say. you know, Given the time I've been at Troy, right? Um, but I think the thing too is there's a couple things to try to wrap this up. Um, there's the scholars talking about whether it's likely and treating it as a social phenomena to be explained, predicted, understood. Then there's the people using the rhetoric of civil war, promoting the the rhetoric, the metaphor, the things you were talking about, right? The pick a side, the us versus them, the crafting of enemy images, um, that are I'm arguing are not actually aimed at getting to a civil war, but create the appearance of it, certainly, and probably are trying to generate fear amongst people that one will occur. Therefore, they need to pick a side and be there. Um, and I think there's a gap between, I think there's two different groups talking about civil war for different reasons,
Mhm.
and we can criticize both of them as we have, I think. And whether or not it occurs, I just can't get away from this prediction that um, if it will be more Timothy McVeigh, more January 6th, then there will be some people maybe planning, there will be some people doing things, but they will be kind of working against the overall system
Mhm.
in a way the IRA wasn't. The
Yeah.
IRA was working with Sinn Fein, right? It's when they get the provisional and the real IRA, when they start getting splinter groups, that they shut them down, right? Those guys had to be shut down, and they had a peace process to do it. But the real troubles were when those two organizations were working symbiotically, the peaceful one and the extreme and the violent one, and that they were, they put a lot of effort into keeping it going. And I see the disconnect. I don't see the connect there in American politics that I would see in Ireland. So
Not comparable.
I don't know what we do with that. All right. Well, that was a discussion. I don't know how I edit this puppy. Maybe we just put it up and
Yeah.
see what people think. But thank you, Rich, for coming in and talking this out. We went some decidedly non-boring places with this.
I know
Next
they're
time,
supposed to be boring.
we'll have to just get back on track next time and be coma-inducing.
Mhm. Fair enough.
All right. Thank you, Rich,
No problem. Thank you for having me.
and thanks everyone for listening.